Welcome to This Feels Familiar. I'm your host, Minaa B. I'm a therapist, author, and creator of the Siblinghood Theory. And this show explores the themes of belonging, conflict, and the relational patterns shaping your life. Let's dive in. As a therapist who specializes in sibling relationships, I feel like the topic of siblinghood and sibling relationships in general is very under discussed when it comes to the family dynamic, but also it's highly under researched. And so, for the month of April, since April 10th is National Siblings Day, I am going to be doing a sibling series. And for today's episode, I'm going to finally address a common question I'm always asked as a therapist who specializes in sibling relationships, which is why do siblings drift apart in adulthood? Or how is it that siblings can grow up in the same household but not be close like best friends? So, today I'm going to answer those questions. And if you have a question of your own, I'd love for you to leave them in the comments if you're listening on Spotify. Now, there's this assumption that siblings are supposed to be close. That because you grew up together, shared a childhood, survived the same family dynamics, you should naturally stay connected into adulthood. And when that doesn't happen, when you realize you barely talk to your sibling, or you're just polite at family gatherings but not actually close, it can feel confusing or even shameful, like something went wrong. But I want you to know that if you're not close to your sibling, you're not alone. And it doesn't necessarily mean something is broken. Sometimes siblings drift apart for reasons that have nothing to do with either of you being a bad person. Sometimes it's developmental, sometimes it's circumstantial, and sometimes the distance started way earlier than you realize. So today, we're going to break down why siblings grow apart, not to make you feel guilty, but to help you understand what happened in your relationship. Because once you understand the why, you can decide what you want to do about it, whether that's working to rebuild connection with your sibling or simply accepting the distance and letting go of the guilt. So, before we dive deeper into today's episode, I'm going to ask that you take a moment to subscribe to this show so that you don't miss an episode. Now, let's start here because this is something a lot of people don't want to admit. Sometimes the closeness you remember from childhood wasn't actually closeness, it was proximity. You shared a room, you rode to school together, you sat at the same dinner table, you had no choice but to be around each other. And that forced togetherness can feel like closeness when you're young, but it's not the same as genuine connection. Research on sibling relationships show that many siblings who drift apart in adulthood were actually performing closeness in childhood, held together by parental expectations and physical proximity rather than authentic connection. Think about it. How many of your childhood interactions with your sibling were genuine versus mandatory participation? The car rides, the shared chores, the shared room, the family vacations where neither of you had a say. You were together because you had to be, not because you chose to be. And then adulthood happens. You move out or your sibling moves out. Your parents stop orchestrating Sunday dinners. There's no more shared bedroom or bathroom schedule, no more automatic inclusion in each other's daily lives. And suddenly, without those external structures forcing you together, the relationship reveals what was always underneath it, which is sometimes nothing. That familiar feeling of realizing you don't actually know your sibling as an adult, that's because you might not have truly known them as children either. You knew the version of them that existed within the family system. But once that system dissolved, so did the connection. And here's something else to remember. There's often guilt around this. You think, well, we grew up together, we should be close. But I want you to remember that closeness isn't automatic just because you share DNA with someone and a childhood home. Real connection requires choice, effort, and genuine compatibility. And sometimes those things just aren't there. And even when siblings genuinely care about each other, personality differences can create distance that's hard to bridge. You might be introverted and need a lot of alone time. Your sibling might be extroverted and interpret your need for space as rejection. You might be conflict avoidant and prefer to let things go. Your sibling might be direct and confrontational and see your avoidance as passive aggressive. These aren't moral failings on either side, they're just differences in how you're wired. But over time, those differences can make the relationship feel exhausting. Every interaction requires translation. You're constantly adjusting to each other's communication styles, and eventually it starts to feel like too much work. Research shows that sibling relationships in adulthood often become what's called open field relationships, voluntary relationships where siblings cooperate as long as exchanges feel rewarding for both. If the relationship consistently feels draining or mismatched, siblings naturally decrease interaction. And this is especially true when siblings have very different values or lifestyles. So I want you to think about this. Maybe you're deeply religious and your sibling is not, and that impacts how you bond. Maybe you have kids and they're child free by choice. Maybe you're politically opposite. These differences don't have to end a relationship, but sometimes they do, especially when those differences touch core parts of your identity and neither of you feels seen or respected by the other. So, that familiar feeling when talking to your sibling feels like walking on eggshells, well, when you're constantly editing yourself or bracing for judgment, that's the exhaustion of fundamental incompatibility. And sometimes the healthiest thing to do is stop forcing a closeness that was never genuinely there. Now, I want to shift gears really quickly because I want to talk about how mental illness and addiction can devastate sibling relationships in ways that are rarely talked about. When one sibling is struggling with severe mental illness like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or psychosis, or with addiction, the other sibling often experiences profound loss. Research on siblings of people with severe mental illness shows that they report significantly higher levels of psychological distress, including depression and anxiety, compared to people without a sibling with mental illness. But it's not just the distress, it's the grief. Siblings describe experiencing ongoing grief due to the loss of the connection they shared with their sibling before illness onset. One sibling in a study described their sibling with mental illness as both present and not present, which fundamentally changed their experience of home life. And then there's the role confusion. Siblings of people with mental illness or addiction often get pushed into roles they never asked for. This dynamic breeds resentment, not toward the sibling for being ill, but toward the situation, toward parents who expect you to fill impossible roles, toward a system that ignores your needs while also centering your sibling's illness. And for some siblings, the only way to survive is to create distance. Research shows that siblings of adults with severe mental illness often distance themselves as a coping mechanism to control the impact it has on their own lives. So it's not cruelty, it's often done because of self preservation. The same is true for addiction. Studies on siblings whose brother or sister struggled with substance use described families characterized by chaos, violence, and broken trust. When one sibling's addiction dominates the family system, the other sibling's needs become secondary. And after years of being secondary, many siblings just choose to walk away. Now, let's talk about the family system, because here's something most people don't realize. The quality of your sibling relationship isn't just about you and your sibling, it's about the family system you grew up in. Family cohesion refers to the emotional bonding between family members, how connected, supported, and emotionally attuned the family is as a unit. When family cohesion is low, siblings often struggle to develop strong emotional bonds with each other. So think about it this way. If your family didn't model healthy connection, if feelings weren't talked about, if conflict was avoided or explosive, if everyone operated in their own silos, then you and your sibling never learned how to emotionally attune to each other. You didn't learn how to read each other's emotional cues, how to offer support, how to repair after conflict. Research on sibling relationships show that family level processes like parental conflict, lack of emotional support, and poor communication directly impact sibling relationship quality. When the family environment is characterized by chaos, neglect, or emotional unavailability, siblings often turn away from each other rather than toward each other. Doesn't that make sense? And if your parents weren't modeling warmth, empathy, or emotional safety, how were you supposed to offer that to your sibling? You were both just trying to survive the same dysfunctional system. In some cases, siblings in high conflict families do turn toward each other for support. They become allies against the chaos, but more often, especially when there's favoritism, abuse, or severe dysfunction, siblings see each other as competitors or threats rather than sources of comfort. So when there's poor family cohesion, there's no framework for maintaining sibling relationships in adulthood. If your family never emphasized connection, never created rituals or traditions that brought you together, never modeled what it looks like to stay close across distance or life changes, then you and your sibling have no blueprint for how to maintain a relationship once you're no longer under the same roof. And so that feeling of not knowing how to connect with your sibling now that you're adults, that makes sense. If every conversation feels awkward or surface level, that's often because you never learned how to connect deeply in the first place because your family system didn't teach you. Also, here's something critical. Not all sibling distance begins in adulthood. For some siblings, the alienation started in pre adolescence or adolescence and it just became more visible in adulthood. Research shows that sibling conflict and alienation can begin early, sometimes as young as middle childhood, especially when there are significant temperament differences, abuse in the home, or intense parental favoritism. Maybe you and your sibling were fundamentally different from the start. One of you was sensitive, the other was rough. One of you was rule following, the other was rebellious. And instead of those differences being honored, they created friction that never got resolved. Or maybe there was abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual between siblings is far more common than people acknowledge. Research shows that 70% of families report physical violence between siblings, and sibling violence occurs more frequently than other forms of child abuse. When one sibling abuses another, or when both siblings are being abused by a parent and turn on each other, that creates a rupture that rarely heals on its own. Or maybe the favoritism was so extreme that it poisoned the relationship before you even hit puberty. One sibling became the golden child, the other became the scapegoat, and that dynamic created resentment and distance that only deepened over time. The point is, if the rift started in childhood and was never addressed, adulthood doesn't magically fix it. In fact, adulthood often makes it worse because now you have the freedom to avoid each other entirely. You don't have to sit at the same dinner table anymore. You don't have to share a room, which basically means you don't have to pretend. So, when you're looking back at your childhood and realizing you and your sibling were never actually close, that distance you feel now isn't new, it's just more obvious. That is the truth surfacing. The relationship was fractured early, and neither of you knew how to repair it. Even siblings who were close in childhood can drift apart in adulthood simply because life takes you in different directions. And that's what I want to unpack. Research on sibling relationships in emerging adulthood shows that siblings who don't live together report decreases in both closeness and conflict. They simply have less contact and less emotional intensity. So think about the life transitions that create distance: leaving for college, getting married, having kids, moving for a job, going through a divorce, dealing with a parent's illness or death. Each of these transitions is an opportunity for siblings to either come together or conflict around those issues can make them drift apart. And often, if they drift apart, it's not because anyone is doing anything wrong, but because your lives no longer overlap. You're busy with your own family, they're focused on their career, you live in different cities, maybe even different countries. The shared experiences that once bonded you, growing up in the same house, navigating the same parents, are in the past, and the present doesn't give you much to connect over. Research shows that geographic distance plays a significant role in sibling closeness. Siblings who live near each other are more likely to have regular contact and maintain closeness. Siblings who live far apart often find that the relationship fades, not from a lack of love, but from a lack of proximity and shared daily life. And then there's the issue of diverging values and lifestyles. As I shared earlier, maybe you became very religious and your sibling is atheist. Maybe you're politically opposed. These differences create gaps that feel impossible to bridge, especially when every conversation turns into a debate about your lifestyle and one of you feels judgment. So, when you're realizing you have nothing to talk about with your sibling anymore, that every phone call feels forced or surface level, that can happen when your lives diverge and you don't have a strong enough foundation to bridge the gap. Now, quick pause. If you're finding this helpful, please take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review. It helps more people find these conversations. And if this episode is resonating with you, share this with someone who might need to hear it, including your sibling, because sometimes just understanding why distance happens can take away some of the guilt. Now, let's talk about how unresolved childhood conflict and resentment can impact sibling relationships. Sometimes siblings drift apart because there's unresolved hurt from childhood that never got addressed. Maybe your sibling bullied you when you were kids, and they probably still do. Maybe they sided with a parent who was abusive. Maybe they got all the attention and you felt invisible. Or maybe they borrowed money and never paid you back. They could have done something cruel during a vulnerable moment and never apologized. These hurts don't just disappear because you're adults now, they linger. And if they were never acknowledged and never repaired, they create a barrier that makes closeness impossible. Research on sibling estrangement shows that most people who have little or no contact with their siblings describe their families as characterized by favoritism, abuse, and disputes. Many also describe their sibling as having sided with a parent over maintaining the sibling relationship. And here's the thing, you can't force someone to acknowledge harm they caused. You can bring it up, but if they minimize it, deny it, or tell you to get over it, there's nothing you can do. The relationship can't heal if the other person refuses to see the wound they caused. So you have two choices. You can keep trying and keep getting hurt, or accept that the relationship isn't safe and create distance and boundaries. A lot of people choose distance, not because they don't love their sibling, but because they love themselves enough to stop accepting harm. So if you recognize you know exactly what your sibling did to hurt you, but they act like it never happened, and you're carrying resentment for the fact that they're not naming it, that's the weight of unresolved conflict. And sometimes the only way to put it down is to set a boundary around it or to walk away. Now, let's talk about the parental role and how when parents die or become ill, this also has a major influence on the sibling relationship. Parental illness and death are major inflection points for sibling relationships. They either bring siblings together or push them further apart. Research shows that when parents need care or when they die, sibling dynamics often intensify. Siblings who are already close may become closer as they navigate caregiving or grief together. But siblings who are already distant often become more estranged, especially if there's conflict over inheritance, caregiving responsibilities, or even unresolved family issues. Maybe one sibling takes on all the caregiving and resents the others for not helping. Maybe there's a fight over the will. Maybe the old favoritism dynamics resurface when you see who your parent leaves what to or who they ask for in their final days. And after the parent dies, the glue that held the sibling relationship together, even if it was a dysfunctional glue, is gone. There's no more obligation to show up for the holidays, no more mediator, no more reason to pretend. For some siblings, this is when they finally admit the relationship was never real. It was always about the parents, and now that the parents are gone, there's nothing left. So, what can you do about sibling distance? I'm going to give you some tips on how you can navigate sibling distance in a way that's healthy. The first thing is you have to find a way to let go of the guilt. If you're not close with your sibling, that doesn't make you a bad person, and it doesn't mean you did something bad. Distance doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it just means you're incompatible. Ask yourself, Based off my siblings' temperament and personality, if they were a stranger that I met, would I choose to be their friend? It doesn't necessarily make you a bad person for saying you don't want to be friends with any and everyone, right? So, even though this is someone you're related to, you might realize that if they were a stranger, I wouldn't pick them. I wouldn't choose to have them in my life because of X reason, because we're very different, because of their attitude, because of their personality, maybe because of their values, and because of whatever those things are, there just isn't closeness. I also encourage you to grieve what wasn't. If you wanted a close sibling relationship and didn't get one, that's a real loss, and you need to let yourself grieve it. Grieve the sibling bond you saw other people have. Grieve the support you wish you've gotten. Grieving doesn't mean giving up, it means acknowledging reality. The next thing you need to do is decide what you actually want. Do you want to rebuild the relationship, or do you want to accept the distance and stop forcing something that isn't working? Both are valid, but you have to be honest with yourself about what you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want. If you want to reconnect, start small. Don't try to fix decades of distance in one conversation. Start with low stakes contact, a text, a short phone call. See if there's any genuine interest on both sides. If there is, build slowly. If there isn't, that tells you something important. Quick disclaimer, however, if you're not close to your sibling because they've chosen to be estranged from you and they've made it very clear that they do not want to speak to you or talk to you, then I would advise you to respect that boundary. So, reconnecting and starting small may not necessarily apply to your situation if your sibling explicitly informed you that they do not want to have any contact with you. Now, the next thing I want you to think about is setting boundaries around harm. If your sibling has hurt you and refuses to acknowledge it, you don't owe them continued access to you. You can love someone from a distance. You can wish them well without being in relationship with them. Protecting yourself is not the same as holding a grudge. You're literally just setting a boundary. I also want you to accept that you can't control their response. So you can reach out, you can try to repair, but you can't force your sibling to meet you there. Again, there are going to be times where the reason why your sibling won't accept your response or your attempts to repair is because maybe you were the person who harmed them. And so reaching out also means, are you reaching out to apologize? Are you reaching out to repair? Understand that it's up to your sibling also to decide if they want to be in relationship with you. I also encourage you to find your people elsewhere, and this is where chosen siblinghood comes in. If your sibling isn't your person, that's okay. You can build chosen family. You can find the kind of support and connection you need in friendships, partnerships, and community. Blood doesn't automatically create bonds. I also want you to be honest about what the relationship can and can't be. Maybe you'll never be best friends with your sibling, but maybe you can be friendly acquaintances who show up for big family events and keep it polite. That's not a failed relationship, it is just a reality of what your relationship is. I also want you to stop performing closeness. If the relationship isn't real, stop pretending it is. Stop forcing phone calls that feel empty. Stop forcing yourself to go on these dinner dates where you listen to them talk but you never share because you don't want to be vulnerable with them. Stop showing up out of obligation and resenting it. Let the relationship be what it actually is, not what you wish it was, but also not what your sibling wants it to be. Lastly, remember you're allowed to change your mind. If you've been distant and you want to reconnect, you can try. If you've been trying to reconnect and it's not working, you can stop. You're not locked into any decision forever. Give yourself permission to reassess as you grow. Sibling relationships are complicated. They're shaped by proximity and personality, by family dynamics and life circumstances, by hurt that was never healed and distance that was never bridged. Not all sibling relationships are meant to be close. Some siblings are genuinely incompatible. Some relationships were damaged too early and too deeply to repair. Some drift apart simply because life took you in different directions and there wasn't enough foundation to hold you together. None of that makes you a bad person, and none of that really makes your sibling a bad person. It doesn't mean either of you failed. It just means the relationship is what it is. Your job is to be honest about what you want, what you're willing to do, and what you're willing to accept. And then to make peace with whatever that looks like, whether it's rebuilding connection, accepting distance, or something in between. So if this episode resonated with you, please rate and subscribe to the show. It helps more people find these conversations. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, All the Hard Things, on Substack, where I go deeper into these topics. And if you haven't already, please grab a copy of my book, Owning Our Struggles, which is sold wherever books are sold if you want to continue learning from me. Now, if that familiar feeling of distance with your sibling, whether it's painful or peaceful, whether you want to fix it or you've accepted it, is something you're navigating right now, here's what I want you to remember. You're allowed to let the relationship be what it actually is. You don't have to force closeness that was never genuinely there. And you don't have to carry guilt for a distance that makes sense given everything you've lived through. Until next time.